So it is my pleasure as Director of Research and Engagement at the Foundation to introduce the next panel of the day, which brings together a set of outstanding thought leaders on Asia from here in New Zealand and offshore to discuss whether the proliferation of new arrangements in the region, the Quad, the Squad, G7, G20, Belt and Road, and more, herald a new world order. So please welcome to the stage, or already on the stage, Professor Natasha Hamilton-Hart, Professor in the Department of Management and International Business at Auckland University and Director of the New Zealand Asia Institute. Dr. Ian Story, Senior Fellow at the ICES Yusof Ishak Institute, who is joining us from Singapore. Associate Professor Jason Young, Director of the New Zealand Contemporary China Research Centre and Associate Professor in the School of History, Philosophy, Political Science and International Relations at Victoria University of Wellington. And the panel moderator, Professor Alex Tan, Head of Department and Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Canterbury here in New Zealand. And there is the faint ringing of bells now, but I think we can talk over that. So we'll proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko atautahi te kainga he ahorangi I ao te whare wananga o Waitaha. Ko Alex Tan tōku ingoa. I am from Christchurch. I'm a professor at the University of Canterbury. My name is Alex Tan. Greetings everyone, and good afternoon to everyone. Today we have a very distinguished panel here, but before I start, I just want to make note that the Foundation did invite Professor Chen Dongxiao from Shanghai Institute of International Studies. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it here due to a conflict in scheduling. Today, the topic that we have here, Insights on Asia, Quad, Squad, G7, G20, RCEP, Belt and Road, SAGAR, and a New World Order. I have to admit, that last one, I had to search. And to me, I know most of what these terms are, but it's increasingly sounding like a K-pop band name. There you go. So the session really is provides an opportunity to discuss regional and global geopolitical trends with a focus on the future of multilateralism in the region. The first panel today did set us up quite well. And ahead of time, Julia did share a set of questions that can be talked about by our panelists, and I do not want to take more time than that because I know we only have an hour and apparently a very short afternoon tea. So let me start with having Ian go with the first round, and then we'll just go by order, Ian, Natasha, and then Jason. Ian, take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Asia New Zealand Foundation for inviting me to this event, and also to say happy 30th birthday. I'm approaching that age myself. Be there in about 5 years' time, I think it is. So look forward to hitting that milestone myself. So in the time available for me today, the 10 minutes, are we on? Is it okay? A bit closer? Okay, yeah, okay. I can hear myself now. I'd like to talk about the issue of mini-lateralism and security in the Indo-Pacific, and specifically what are the implications for ASEAN. So over the past decade, we've seen witnessed the rise of mini-lateralism in the region. They're mostly, but not exclusively, US-led groupings composed of major and middle powers that have similar values and interests and are focused on tangible outcomes. They include, of course, the Quad, the US, India, Japan, and Australia. The Squad, I'm not quite sure what the S is in the Squad, but that's the US, Japan, Philippines, and Australia. Maybe it's the last letter from the Philippines that makes it the Squad. And AUKUS, of course. Now, AUKUS is a very special mini-lateralism. I wouldn't class it as a security grouping per se. To my mind, AUKUS is a defense industrial agreement. That is the primary purpose of AUKUS. It is to equip the Royal Australian Navy with nuclear-powered submarines. So I think that's in a class of its own. But I know AUKUS is of huge interest to this country and this audience, so maybe we can talk about it later. We might also be able to include some economic-focused minilateral groupings like IPEF, I'm not entirely sure what IPEF is. I don't think any of its members are quite so sure either, but it's one of the frameworks of the US. So I said that not all of these mini-laterals were US-led. There's the CPTPP, which the US pulled out of, and perhaps that's, I don't know, Japanese-led, or initially it was actually several ASEAN countries that proposed the TPP. BRICS is sometimes mentioned as a mini-lateral forum, but I think that's probably a little big to be included. And even, sorry, not BRICS, Belt and Road is sometimes mentioned as a mini-lateral. I think that's too big. BRICS, of course, it's 4, and then it's 9, and possibly new countries coming in next year. The Quad, of course, gets the lion's share of the attention, but I would like to draw your attention to another Quad that seems to be emerging. It's the Bizarro Quad, to put it in Superman terms. That is a grouping of 4 countries that share similar autocratic values and are opposed to US primacy in the region. So that's Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And it'll be interesting to see how those 4 countries move forward going forward. But let's focus on the US-led mini-laterals. Why has there been a proliferation of these groups in the last decade? I think there's at least 4 motivating factors. The first is it's clearly a reflection of increasing US-China competition and the fact that the US has adopted a hard balancing strategy against China. Hard balancing, probably first adopted by the Trump administration, continued by the Biden administration, and almost certainly competition with China will be the central organizing principle of the next administration, be it Trump 2 or Harris. Second, I think it reflects greater strategic convergence among the US and its allies and partners about the challenges posed from China, who share a common desire to prevent or oppose or counter the creation of a Sino-centric order in Asia. And this includes Japan, South Korea, India in that group. The third, and I think there's not 4 motivating factors, there's only 3. I must have dropped one. The third motivating factor, and I think possibly the most important for our discussion today, is a recognition among the US and its partners that the broad and inclusive membership of ASEAN-led forums makes action-oriented consensus on security issues too hard. And that's a problem that's exacerbated by ASEAN's own structural constraints in terms of bureaucratic inertia, weak institutionalism, and a lack of resources, which prevents ASEAN from forming effective responses to regional security issues. What do they include? Well, Titinan mentioned this morning the civil war in Myanmar, which ASEAN has struggled to deal with and has made no impact so far. The South China Sea dispute. ASEAN and China have been negotiating a code of conduct for a decade now, and they're getting nowhere very fast or very slowly. That agreement isn't going to be signed anytime soon. Even if it is, if and when it's signed, I mean, I don't think anyone seriously thinks, and that includes people in the ASEAN Secretariat, that it will fundamentally change the central dynamics of that dispute or lead to a reduction in tensions. To me, the ASEAN-China negotiations for a code of conduct seem completely divorced from what's going on in the South China Sea itself. Excuse me. So does minilateralism challenge ASEAN centrality? Well, what is ASEAN centrality? ASEAN itself doesn't define it, deliberately so. I think they want to keep it ambiguous. They want to keep us guessing what ASEAN centrality is. But let's say if we define it as ASEAN being the sort of the regional anchor of the regional security architecture, and ASEAN's admittedly extremely impressive convening power in these various forums that meet every year. Does minilateralism challenge that centrality? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. The Quad members have all voiced their support for ASEAN centrality, and they've tried to dock their respective Indo-Pacific strategies with ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And I really think that they're paying more than lip service to ASEAN centrality. I think ASEAN's dialogue partners understand how important ASEAN is. They certainly understand how important it is for the member states of ASEAN. And it would seem egregious to simply ignore ASEAN or in any way be disrespectful, and also because that would be an opening for China as well, which is clearly not in their interests. So mini-lateral groupings are not designed to displace ASEAN. I think they're seen by their members as parallel or complementary institutions, ones that can achieve the desired security outcomes that ASEAN has not been able to. What is ASEAN's view and its member states of mini-lateralism? Well, as Titina mentioned this morning, from the outset when ASEAN was founded in 1967, ASEAN rejected an overt political military role, and the bloc has not opposed member states' security cooperation with external powers, either bilaterally or in mini-lateral organizations. So America's alliances with the Philippines and Thailand, and of course the five-power defense arrangements, which were established in 1971. Nor has ASEAN opposed mini-lateral security cooperation within the grouping itself. I'm thinking here of the Malacca Straits patrols and also the trilateral maritime patrols in the Sulu and Celebes Seas. I mean, after all, ASEAN states are well aware of ASEAN's limitations and its constraints. They know it's not the only game in town. What I think ASEAN is opposed to as a group is any attempt to try and supersede it, to supersede that centrality role. And I'm sure you all remember Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's Asia-Pacific community, which all the ASEAN states pushed back on very hard in 2008. ASEAN states themselves have joined mini-lateral groupings, CPTPP, IPEF, Belt and Road, if we include that, BRICS soon. Thailand and Malaysia have applied for membership of BRICS. Myanmar, Cambodia, and a few others will probably be next. With regard to the Quad and AUKUS, our annual State of Southeast Asia survey, which is published by my institution, shows that across the region there is actually a majority support for Quad. It's seen as reinforcing regional stability, not undermining it. I think that most of the ASEAN states are relatively comfortable with AUKUS, certainly Vietnam, Singapore, and the Philippines. And the concerns of Indonesia and Malaysia, which were expressed when AUKUS was first announced in 2021, I think they have been eased, assuaged, primarily because of efforts of Australia to explain what AUKUS is all about. Will ASEAN states join Quad, even if in the unlikely event they were invited, which isn't going to happen? No, I don't think they would. The ASEAN states don't like to choose sides. And anyway, the member states, they lack the military, the economic, and the technical capabilities of the other Quad members. But we can't rule out Quad plus naval exercises in the future. I think that would be okay. So to sum up, mini-laterals may not be designed to displace ASEAN, but their growth highlights ASEAN's limitations. I don't think that ASEAN member states will change the organization's MO to address some of the shortcomings it has, or to strengthen the organization by giving it more financial resources. So I think that ASEAN is likely to retain that centrality role in the regional security architecture. But as great power competition escalates and these mini-lateral groupings strengthen, then there's the possibility that some of the organization's dialogue partners may become less invested in the ASEAN-led process. That's a potential issue going forward. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Ian. May I ask Natasha?
Thank you very much, and my thanks to the Foundation for convening us all here today, but also more enduringly being a kind of shining light for sustaining interest in Asia and really being the best performing New Zealand institution that carries out the mission to educate the New Zealand public about Asia, because the universities have not been playing their part, in my view. But anyway, I was asked to talk a bit about the economic architecture of the region. And so what I want to do in the next 10 minutes is just briefly remind people of the way in which regional integration has occurred over the last 40 years or so, and how that structure of regional integration has come up against the new force of security intruding into business decisions, which, although there is nothing new under the sun, it is relatively new in our lifetimes for this region. So let me start with the structure of regional integration, and don't worry, I'm not going to read out a list of acronyms, because although the region is quite well known for having an awful lot of these mini-lateral and also bilateral preferential trading agreements, I do not think that they really capture what has driven the regional integration over the last 40 years. No disrespect to the MFAT diplomats who go out and negotiate trade agreements. They're very good at it. That's what they do. But that largely is not the way most countries in Asia have formed close connections. I would say, in fact, that many of the PTAs that exist in the region are, in some sense, a lagging indicator, because they come about when there has been a realignment of interest at the domestic level in each country. And that realignment of interest and preferences has been produced through the processes of regional production and investment flows and trade flows, which have seen, all of our consumer goods that we use and handle every day, their production is fragmented across many different locations and is, in that sense, market-led. But this is not a market of arm's length, price-based transactions. It is often described as being structured through network-like connections among business entities, but also businesses as they have interacted with their host governments. So if you want to look at the patterns of regional specialization where these complex value chains have spread production across different parts of Asia, producing the factory Asia that we often hear about, and in doing so, they have reaped enormous economies of scale and specialization and agglomeration. And these have been coordinated in many ways, not just on the basis of firm-to-firm connections, but also connections with their host governments, which have specialized in different kinds of relationships with a variety of private enterprises. Now, that structure of regional integration has always depended on outside extra-Asian markets, although intra-Asian markets were becoming increasingly important. But it was also very clear right up to the cusp of COVID that what was emerging was essentially a Sino-centric regional economy with an increasing convergence of production and trade flows centering on China, not just for the Chinese market, but also for re-export to the rest of the world. This structure of de facto regionalization, which has, maybe it began with Japan investing from the late 80s, but with the rise of China as both an investment site, but also an outward investment, spurred along through Chinese initiatives to promote infrastructure development, has created a web of connectivity that was pushing the region increasingly towards a Sino-centric integrated production base. Then we had COVID, which sensitized, not only did that create a sort of trade bottleneck in a physical sense, but it sensitized many players to the risks of having too much of your production centered in one place. But simultaneously, we also had the hardening of US-China competition, which has put, the word geopolitics back into the business school where it hasn't belonged for a very long time. So there have also been underlying shifts which were also underway probably before COVID even, which is that as China was becoming an increasingly technologically capable and leading power, it was shedding some of the low-end production, having reached the sort of pressures of wage growth, and therefore some of that Chinese investment was starting to move, or not just investment by Chinese actors, but foreign investors in China were starting to relocate some of their lower-end activities out of China even before COVID. But since we have seen the rise of the sort of security tension related first to the trade war and then the tech war, we have certainly seen an increase in what is called the decoupling of economies. And I want to make just 5 observations about what that decoupling implies. And the first one is that there is, in fact, no economic logic or self-interest that will prevent it from happening. There were some quite rational voices early in the trade war saying there will be automatic limits to the decoupling process because of the self-interest of private actors in the United States and in China and elsewhere, who have become so tightly enmeshed and mutually dependent at the level of operating systems, of electronics, and deep, complex interdependencies that they will never allow this to spread. Well, I think the point is that no, it is not economically rational, but that doesn't mean it isn't going to spread, because once you move from an ethos in which connections are forged on the basis of economies of scale and specialization, and the logic of efficiency is driving transactions, and then you come to one where both genuine security motives but also the logic of good old-fashioned protectionism is driving, then there is no sort of emergency brake that will necessarily kick in to prevent further decoupling. There is no way, I don't think, TSMC would not be building a semiconductor fab in Arizona if they were driven by economic logic. The second observation I would make is that for Southeast Asia, which is the part of the region that I know best, so far this moment has been good for the region, that they have captured investments and opportunities as foreign companies have pulled some of their investments out of China, and indeed actually Chinese companies have started moving more of their investments out of China in order to circumvent trade tariffs and other barriers. A lot of that has gone to places like Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia, as well as India to some extent, but a lot of it has gone to Southeast Asia because it was able to build on some of the pre-existing industrial capacity that already existed. So in that sense, it's been good news for the regional economies who have been able to capture parts of the decoupling, the bit that hasn't been reshored, some of that has then gone to these regional economies. Semiconductors, EVs, battery, and clean tech sort of upstream industries as well have seen major investments. But the third point I would make is that the opportunities that the region has been able to capture so far are actually very vulnerable and, in a sense, fragile, because sustaining this kind of development not only requires a certain amount of domestic capacity, which may or may not be forthcoming in some of these countries, but relies on the United States and China exercising a degree of mutual forbearance, and that is a willingness to tolerate a degree of supply chain intermingling, which, if the logic of decoupling is really pushed, will become unsustainable. Because at the moment, if you look, say, at the rise of Vietnamese exports to the United States, which clearly reflects some of the shift of industrial production out of China into Vietnam. But simultaneously, Vietnam still depends, and in fact increasingly relies on intermediate products produced in China. And the same can be said of many of the regional economies which have invested in, say, minerals required for EV battery production and others, that in that supply chain or in the investment link behind that, there is still a connection to China, and therefore there is a vulnerability to increasing protectionist or security-driven blocs. The fourth point is a fairly basic one, is that there's a lot of talk about diversification, but in fact, in some cases, this is concentrated supply chains and markets. So in fact, the region could be less resilient to a future disruption, whether it's a natural disaster or something more man-made. And finally, and this is of relevance to New Zealand, is that the vulnerabilities go beyond what we think of as sensitive sectors of semiconductors and robotics and dual-use technology. Particularly with the advent and increasing importance of digitization and data standards, these will become an increasingly important point of tension where questions around what kind of cloud storage you're going to use, what kind of physical data infrastructure, what is the hardware that you're going to use, what are the data encryption standards, what are the privacy laws that you're going to abide by. These are going to throw at minimum sand in the wheels of international commerce, and for some companies it will make it impossible to do business in both directions. And I wanted to note that Hoso Lee Makiyama earlier this morning said that the era of export-led growth is over. No one's going to be doing that in the future. And this may be true if we think about export-led growth, particularly as, running an export surplus through which you through the arithmetic of GDP, will generate growth. But just because that is over, that doesn't mean there isn't quite a lot of potential for a decline in exports through this decoupling and reshoring to produce a significant dent in growth, because the transaction costs and the deadweight burden of inefficiencies that are being created through grand plans like the US Inflation Reduction Act are all going to add to the costs of production and move us away from an era in which efficiency was really the driving motive of a lot of the growth and export development that we saw. And I think I'm getting the red card, so I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for a lot of interesting points raised. I'm sure everybody's forming their questions. Let me turn to Jason. Jason.
Thank you, Alex, and my congratulations to the Asian New Zealand Foundation as well. 30-year birthday, Shangri Kwaila, Tanjobi Merito. Like Natasha, we've all benefited a lot from the work that the foundation does. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about Southeast Asia, I'm going to talk about China, given its central relevance to this question of the region. I'm just going to make three really simple observations. But first, I noticed that the subtitle for the panel was The Prospect of a New World Order, or a New World Order question mark. And I think the conversation we've already had today, particularly this morning, and then also on this panel, would suggest that the singularity of a new world order would indeed be a very pleasing outcome. But the reality is that we're already in, and perhaps looking to moving towards, a far messier, more complex and overlapping contested multiplicity, or multiplicity of overlapping orders. And of course, the reality is, to some degree, the region of Asia has always been incredibly diverse. And it's really only recently that countries in Asia have had the power and the influence to be able to push and to promote the type of regional order which they feel is best for them. And of course, as I would say, considering what I study, the most significant shift in this regard, and my first point, is of course the rise of the People's Republic of China, which over the last 30 years has radically transformed itself and also the region. So 30 years ago, it was less than 5% of global share of GDP. Today, it's around about 19%, $19 trillion economy, half of the GDP of Asia. So it's a very significant economy. And of course, it's also a manufacturing innovation hub, and it is a leader of the global renewable energy transition. So incredibly important. Whilst it's no longer the most highly populated nation in the world, it's a very close second. And of course, the population is skilled, highly educated, and increasingly wealthy. And this rapid development and transformation has also led to the modernization of the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, an investment in its own security, as Joint Sword 2024B military exercises, which are currently taking place around Taiwan yesterday and today, demonstrate that has allowed the PRC to back up some of its long-standing positions in the region and also to shift its own strategic calculations. And so this, I guess, leads to my second point, which is that for many, and I think for many in New Zealand as well, there are reasons to be uncomfortable with how the PRC is pushing for reforms in terms of global governance, multilateralism, and regional order. But due to the PRC's weight, or to China's weight within the region, we really need to take it seriously and engage with these ideas. Within China, those of you who read the Chinese press will know that the argument is that the world is undergoing changes unseen in a century. There's this big push that power is moving from the West, which is in decline, to the East, which is rising, and that therefore China should have more say in the architecture, the ideas, the norms, the values that shape regional order. And of course, for its part, the United States has pushed back on this idea, and some in New Zealand have as well, and shifted to a posture of strategic competition. To go to my point, I do think that we need to take seriously the ideas that are being presented by such a powerful and influential country in this region. So I'm just going to mention a few of them, which people might not be as familiar with. The first one is the idea of the Global Development Initiative, which was put forth in September 2021. And this is a region-wide push to focus on economic development in Asia, which in itself is a fantastic idea. But some of the challenges, perhaps, for countries like New Zealand is that it proposes that economic development comes before civil and political rights, and it also rejects the idea of including conditions around governance and human rights in its development promotion. The second one, and perhaps the most controversial for the region, is this idea of a global security initiative, which was put forth in April 2022. And this one basically signals, as was mentioned this morning in terms of the conversation about China becoming a great power or a superpower, it basically signals Beijing's desire to be a provider of public security goods in the region and in the world, and establish as a component of many of its bilateral relationships a security component, which we've seen in Southeast Asia, but also seen closer to home in the Pacific. The third one is, of course, the Global Civilization Initiative, which was put forth in March 2023. And this one is quite challenging in the sense that it focuses on the idea of accepting differences across different political, social, economic systems within Asia, as a way of promoting, quote-unquote, true multilateralism. It basically argues that modernization is not the same as westernization. So very much sort of the latest articulation of the Asian values debate, which you must all be very familiar with. And then the fourth one is obviously the Belt and Road Initiative, which I would envisage more as a way of promoting Chinese companies to go abroad. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is that the PRC, or the China, has articulated an alternative vision for the world and for the region, but it's also the initiatives which it's put forward are very, very ambiguous. So when we look at them, some of them could undermine existing norms and institutions, which would be problematic for many countries in the region. and some of them could actually be very positive types of initiatives. And so in that sense, my third point is that in order to navigate this contestation, to understand what these initiatives mean, what they mean for countries like New Zealand, that we should very much invest in, as best as possible, having the skills and the expertise to be able to understand how our region is shifting and what different countries are promoting. So similar to what Natasha was arguing at the very beginning, I would simply say that in terms of the universities within New Zealand, that's become a far more challenging proposal. Simple example would be that in 2014, there were 500 undergraduate students studying Chinese language in New Zealand. 2022, that number had dropped to 250, so it had halved. And I think that that's a very challenging and problematic proposition. And so if countries in the region are perhaps not so much a fence-sitting approach, but more of a understanding what our interests are, what principles we should use to engage in the region, if we want to do that, then I think we need to make a very big effort to understand what is actually changing in a very rapidly evolving region like Asia. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our panelists for sharing really wonderful thoughts that I'm sure many of you would have questions. But also, just let me quickly add my congratulations to the Asian New Zealand Foundation. You are the foundation 30 years. 生日快乐, maligayang kaarawan, sinit快乐. 祝你们前程似锦，一帆风顺. May the wind always be in your sails. May your journey will always be beautiful. You are truly a taonga for New Zealand, a treasure. Lots of food for thought here, and I just want to pick up on what Natasha mentioned on TSMC. In fact, I was told that Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, actually has told Nancy Pelosi that that Arizona factory is not going to make money. And in fact, I've now been told by more sources that the Taiwanese managers there complain that the American engineers are lazy, and the American engineers there complain that the Taiwanese managers are abusive. So again, it's the same story when you have Asian companies invested in the United States. Remember these movies about the Japanese factories there, and then the Obamas funded this movie about a glass factory. The same story. It's the same story. If you've been to Taiwan, that factory is 24/7. That factory is 24/7. So there you go. There's another one the decoupling part, which I recently learned on a trip that was part of the Asian New Zealand Track 2. I was told by a Taiwanese economist at the Chonghua Institution for Economic Research that these standards are already decoupling as well, because Tesla being produced in China and Tesla being produced in the United States are having different components. And the idea of a China plus one, Taiwan is actually facing the challenge of a Taiwan plus one. So they're being told that you should invest outside of Taiwan in the sense of a Taiwan contingency or what have you. So lots of food for thought there. May I open the floor for questions? And my good friend Phil Gibson will always know that I always make a note of this. A question is a question. It starts with why, when, how. So please do not make a statement. Keep it to yourself, because there's a lot of other people who want to ask questions. All right. David.
Thanks very much to all of the speakers for a really interesting panel. My question is to Ian Storey. You said that the proliferation of mini-lateral arrangements, they're not designed to displace ASEAN. They might not be designed to do that, but over time, potentially could you make the argument that they might have the effect of taking attention away from that? And you said that the thing that might trigger ASEAN to be to react to that would be some sort of attempt to supersede it. But could you just see, rather than some kind of parallel grand mini-laterals rising up, just essentially a proliferation of activity just draws energy and attention away from those inclusive frameworks over time, even if the intention is never there at the beginning to displace it?
Yeah, thanks, David. Fair question. As I said, I don't think these mini-laterals, I don't think they're intended to displace ASEAN's central role in regional architecture. They are informal in general, they're informal groupings. There's no reason why the US and its partners would deliberately, egregiously try and upset ASEAN or ASEAN member states. So, but yes, the risk is that as great power competition increases, as I think inevitably it will, and these mini-laterals become more important and perhaps expanded membership, then that poses somewhat of a challenge to ASEAN, that ASEAN's dialogue partners may not be as invested in the ASEAN-led processes as they are. In fact, one might almost argue that's already happening. If we look at the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is also 30 years old this year, I think, 1994, isn't that right? At best, irrelevant, at worst, moribund. I mean, we don't talk about, who talks about the ARF, anymore? It used to be every July it was, something that the press talked about, but we don't really talk about the ARF now. I think the last time was probably when Hillary Clinton attended in 2010. So then, if that is true, and I think it is, what can ASEAN do in response? I mentioned that ASEAN, its institutionalism is weak. Now, why is it weak? That's because the member states want it to be weak. Period. I mean, okay, I think, ASEAN works for the member states. They like it, but they like it the way it is. They don't want to go down an EU road path where countries pool their sovereignty. And they certainly don't want the Secretariat in Jakarta telling them what to do, right? So what do? Okay, question, let's have a quick quiz. How many staff work at the ASEAN Secretariat? Anybody know? It's about 600. How many people work in the European Commission? 23,000. There you go, right? What is the budget? I don't know what the budget of the European Commission is, but ASEAN, I think each ASEAN member state gives, how much is it, Titina? Is it a million? 1 point something million dollars, so just over $10 million. That happens for a reason. They deliberately, maybe starve is too strong a word, but limit the resources that they put into that organization. And that hinders its ability to change. And quite apart from the other issues that ASEAN faces, which again, as Titinan mentioned this morning, it's divided on so many issues. It's divided on US-China, it's divided on Russia-Ukraine. There are somewhat divisions on Myanmar. How do you deal with those problems without making the Secretariat stronger? I don't think you can. So I don't think ASEAN is going to change much. So it may be that over time these mini-laterals, they don't replace ASEAN, but they certainly become much more important. And this is something I think the ASEAN countries, some of them of course are aware of, and some of them want to do something about it, but face these limitations within the organization itself.
I see a raised hand on this side. There, Nick in the back.
Thank you very much for those presentations. This question is for Ian. And I'd like to ask your assessment of ASEAN's own record, its voluntary decision to expand ASEAN membership 1995 through to 1999. And your assessment, has that been a success or not?
I thought thought you people were my friends. ASEAN expansion. I think there are some member states, the one I live in, for instance, there are some people in that country who believe that expansion was a mistake. I've heard people say that ASEAN, it made consensus decision-making much harder. It increased the number of meetings and the number of resources they had to put into it. And as you know, several countries, several members, Singapore included, actually mainly Singapore, was opposed to Timor-Leste joining. And one of the arguments put forward by some people was that, look, we already have enough weak members, we don't need another one. And also a concern that any new members might monetize their veto. I won't explain that any further. I think you all understand what that means. But here we are. I mean, there's 10, soon to be 11 members. We can't go back, we can't change it. There's no mechanism to expel a member. So even if you talk about Myanmar, expelling, that actually can't be done. There's no mechanism to do that. So is it a success? Define success. If the initial goal of ASEAN expansion was to have all the regional countries in one organization so that they could at least try and speak with one voice, which is hard, then it has been a success. Otherwise, it's introduced a lot of difficulties into the organization, and maybe with the admission of Timor-Leste, and I'm not opposed to Timor-Leste, I think it should be inside the organization, not outside. It makes a lot of sense. Then that could increase those problems, adding to the organization's already long list of issues.
Yes, there in the back.
Hi, Peter Yates from the Asia Foundation. Thanks for the presentations. My question's to you, Jason. You mentioned China's global initiative, GDI, GSI. I wonder, when we're thinking about mini-laterals, what China might be thinking about, learning about from the risks and opportunities of these other efforts, like the Quad and the Squad and so on, and whether we might be likely to see greater efforts on the mini-lateral stage from China?
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I would suggest not, perhaps. There's already the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and that's sort of the key grouping for security cooperation, anti-terrorism activities, mainly with Central Asia, but also Russia. India, Pakistan have also come on board on that one. There's the BRICS. And then the GDI, GSI, GCI, even the BRI are not really mini-laterals in that normal sense. The sort of groupings of countries that in many ways are quite ambiguous, even the principles behind them, and that are sort of mix and match. So very similar to the use of ideas like a comprehensive strategic partnership. You can have a CSP with a number of different countries, and you can build it in a way that works for that bilateral partnership. So I would be surprised to see China pushing for the types of agreements like the Quad, for example. I think it would be more loosely formed groupings and focusing on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Questions? Yes, Philip.
What do you think about RCEP? Would you categorize that as ASEAN-led or China-led?
RCEP.
RCEP.
RCEP, okay.
That could be all three of you answering. Jason?
Well, I'll simply state that I'm not an expert on RCEP, but I would have thought it would be region-led and a negotiated process, almost a lowest common denominator about what economies are willing to sign up to.
Yeah, I mean, that would be my impression as well, neither. But I also, and I'm quite sure other people would disagree, but I don't see it as independently that significant as a PTA. It's sort of almost more significant, the fact that India withdrew from it. But yeah, I don't see that as an arena in which you're going to see a sort of tug of war around who is driving the trade agenda. To the extent that the preferences matter, it will reinforce the tendency for integration to take place along the Western Pacific, East Asia, because it excludes the US and it also excludes India. But, yeah.
Ian? No?
Nothing to add.
Idina, you have a question? And then Marina.
Thank you. RCEP, I think if you look at the year and a half of negotiations to reach the conclusion, you can see that it was an ASEAN process. But I wanted to just get back to Ian's point about the mini-laterals. De facto and by default, mini-lateralism marginalizes and bypasses ASEAN centrality. And I think that, peak ASEAN was about the mid-2000s, East Asia Summit, maybe up to about 80 mm, 2010, 2012, 80 mm plus. And then after that, we've seen kind of a lot of challenges and erosion, the centrality, and now they can't get much done. And that's why I think the expansion became problematic, but initially, back then, it was an idea of one Southeast Asia away from China. But now I think that there's some rethinking about the ASEAN modality and maybe going to the ASEAN 5, which is much more aligned, and to move in that direction to get things done, which will involve bypassing this ASEAN way, the non-interference and so on. But I have a question for Natasha. The China plus one, and what you mentioned about the gravitation of production networks and towards China is very true. And it also explains the Trump trade wars with China in 2017, 18, 19. But now you can see the trend, direction of companies moving out of China. So the American companies, they go to Vietnam, mainly. A little bit of Thailand, a little bit of Indonesia. The Chinese companies are moving out. They go to Thailand. A little bit of Indonesia, less Vietnam. But now the U.S. is imposing all kinds of controls and tariffs and a barrage of protectionism. So what's going to happen in your view? It seems to me now Southeast Asia will be targeted eventually. So now maybe there will be some diversion to Mexico, Latin America. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that potential has already taken place. That to the extent that companies whose China production was subject to US tariffs have moved to evade the tariffs, then those tariffs are going to catch up with them. And we've seen that on a number of products. So, whether that is driven by genuine security fears or, there's a huge scope for just old-fashioned protectionism to get smuggled under the hood. But I think that is the vulnerability that, Southeast Asia's ability to profit and be able to continue its trade connections and reliance in this regional production networks, its connections through to China, because a lot of the stuff that's coming out of Thailand and in some cases Malaysia as well is, the accusation is that it's only been minimally processed in those places and it largely represents a Chinese product. The reality, whether that's true or not, will vary from product to product. But yeah, I think the upshot will be, because the market closure is, the US and then potentially Europe as well, becoming both much more protectionist, that whether they want to or not, the countries in Southeast Asia are going to increase their reliance on China, or they're going to extricate themselves and say, no, we decisively face, if this friend-shoring thing is for real, we have to be on one side or the other. So the desire not to choose sides, which, to my understanding, all regional leaders have said we do not want to choose between the United States and China, including, very eloquently, both the immediate past, the Prime Minister of Singapore. We don't want to choose, but that choice may be forced on them. So.
Question, yes.
Thank
And then
you.
Susanna, and then Hosso.
My name's Marion Crawshaw. I would like to ask the panel what their views are on what India's global ambitions are. We have a huge amount of discussion on China for obvious reasons, but I think, you just have to follow Modi and Foreign Minister Jaishankar on social media to see that they are here, there and everywhere around the world on their travels. So I wondered if the panel could comment on what's India looking for in a new world order. Thank you.
India. Who wants to start? Ian?
I'm not sure if I can answer that particular question of what India wants, but maybe I can give a few thoughts on how Southeast Asia views India. I think for a long time there was some disappointment that India was not fulfilling its potential. That India, for instance, had been invited into the East Asia Summit and other things and had not played a very proactive role in that. Trade was not very high between India and Southeast Asia. Defense cooperation was not very high. That has all changed or is changing significantly. I think now Southeast Asian countries take India far more seriously than they did 10, 15 years ago. Trade between India and Southeast Asia has been rising very significantly. There's now more defense diplomacy activities between India and Southeast Asian countries. India has started to sell arms to Southeast Asia. That's new. That's a very new development. Whether there's still that disappointment of India perhaps not playing as proactive a role as it could in ASEAN-led forums like the EAS, I'm not so sure about that. But India is being taken much more seriously than it ever was in Southeast Asia, and I think that will only strengthen over time, and that India will become a much more important partner for Southeast Asian countries bilaterally and with ASEAN too. What India thinks about, I'm not too sure. I mean, someone said this morning that, or someone said something, was it this morning? India tends to be sort of focused on South Asia, with Pakistan, with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, with those problems. Can it break out of those regional constraints? I thought for a long time it couldn't. Now I'd revise that position and say it is breaking out from South Asia. It's playing a more active role in Central Asia now, in the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia, and arguably even in East Asia. So it's a country to watch. At my own institute at ICES, we made a decision a year or so ago that we've made the observation, we're not paying enough attention to India, and that has to change. We need more India-focused events, India, Southeast Asia, because it is becoming a bigger player.
Anyone who want to add?
No, I'm not qualified to speak to Indian ambitions, but there is someone in the room who might be. Susan, if you want to chime in. But I will just say that India has obviously, as regards East Asian and Southeast Asian institutions and trade integration, has largely historically stood outside of that, being a much more inward-focused protectionist economy. And sort of symbolic of that was it's in the end, it was not willing to join RCEP. But to the extent that India has also been a recipient of some of the de-risking investments out of China, there have been attempts to develop some of the electronics manufacturing and processing in India, not always smoothly, because there are also issues around labour force discipline, logistics, connectivity. But to the extent that that does develop, it will create a realignment of Indian domestic interests that might position them more favourably to sort of perhaps join a regional PTA in the future.
Susanna.
Yeah, just on India. Thanks, Marion. I think a couple of observations from living there. I think we sometimes forget how complex governing 28 states and 8 union territories is for India, just in terms of bringing the Indian populace along. So a lot of what India discusses to itself is about the pride and rise of India and its role. And I think it's still really buying time in pursuing an interest-based foreign policy as it gains military and economic strength. And through that process and through its discussions with its domestic population is figuring out what India-influenced regional order might look like. So I think it's still sort of figuring that out itself. But, you know, Uttar Pradesh alone, bigger than Brazil. So that's a lot of 28 big states to bring along on that journey.
You have a question?
For Natasha, thank you for your comments. I just wondered, in the world that you painted out in terms of decoupling and sort of the economic irrationality that we're going to face, decisions due to nationalism and patriotism and protectionism and so on, it's a very tough order for New Zealand to operate in. How worried are you for New Zealand in that order, particularly given we do tend to pursue export-led growth with a very tidy set of rules that help protect our interests? Thank you.
Well, I don't want to be the person that sort of spreads negativity all over the room. Look, I think, you know, the imagery from MFAT's last year before, you know, moving into choppy waters. And I think that is the case for New Zealand. And we have our own structural economic growth problems. So what our value proposition is and where our niche in these, you know, at the end of these value chains is, and whether we can break out of being a commodity player. Yeah. We have some work to do.
Very tough. Last question from Husuk here. Right here in front.
Thank you. Fascinating panel, and I will ask a question, and I will make an introductory comment to justify the question, because you already did, Alex, which is about Taiwan. Yes. You mentioned Taiwan being forcefully localized in both Arizona and China. I know which one I think they hate more, but this is actually about the Taiwan question. Assuming that we are stuck with the Greens, and of all the alphabet soups and the variable geometries that you have mentioned in your remarks, and for Ian, I will also add NPT, which mini-lateral, plurilateral, which geometry can be a game changer, do you think, for the Taiwan question, either by slamming the door or opening the door or pretending the door doesn't exist? Which one do you think is the most interesting avenue to look for? And which also inspires me to ask a follow-up question for that. If you don't want to talk about Taiwan, North Korea.
Jason, you start.
In the last 2 minutes.
I would simply say that all of the above, in the sense that it's not going to be one grouping that will be able to work constructively to maintain stability across the Taiwan Strait. You need a combination of good diplomatic political management as well as maintenance of the regional balance of power. So I don't think there can be one grouping like the Quad, or it's ASEAN, or it's going to be NATO, or the Indo-Pacific 4 members of NATO. I think it requires across the board work.
Natasha?
I'm not sure if this is correct. I don't think it will lie in an organisation, but I'm reminded of the strategy that Singapore, in its sort of early independence years, decided that one of the reasons it wanted to invite the world's businesses into Singapore was as a kind of insurance, that if you host enough American corporations, you might get the American fleet sailing to your rescue should you need it. So that's not really, Taiwan already has TSMC on its land, but as an insurance, perhaps we look at where does TSMC go and plant itself. So not just in Arizona, but also in Japan and other places. And so the offshoring of the Taiwanese economy and its critical industries maybe are a kind of insurance strategy for that country. But, I'm also conscious of, I saw a figure of how many TSMC engineers have been hired by China. So, nothing is solid. And North Korea, I pass.
Ian.
I think Taiwan made two very smart decisions in the 80s and 90s. One was to develop its semiconductor industry, and the second was to become a democracy. And that, to me, pretty much guarantees an American response if Taiwan is attacked by China. Also, we have to consider that America's credibility is on the line, that if it didn't help Taiwan, all bets are off with America's security guarantees and relationships. We started this panel off by talking about the fabrication plants in the US. I heard recently that, the people who work at the fabrication plants, they have to wear very, heavy protective clothing that takes several hours to put on, and that they're not allowed bathroom breaks, so they have to wear adult diapers, and that this is going to be a problem for the unions in Arizona. And on that note...
Yes. Incidentally, back in '97, I actually wrote a book on Taiwan's national security dilemmas and opportunities. And in that chapter, Taiwan just had its first presidential election. And I said that if Taiwan wants to secure itself, it has to be at the heart of a supply chain and deepen its democratic consolidation. And probably they didn't hear me, but maybe, I don't know. With that note, I just want to thank everyone for really lovely food for thought for all of us, and to all of you guys for beautiful questions. Let's give a round of applause to our guests.